Hi everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in this video, we are going to be doing a specimen paper walkthrough on Macbeth, and specifically I'll be using the AQA 2015 English Lit paper 1. So let's dive straight into it. So this is a question and it's taken from Act 5, Scene 3 of the play, and the point in which Macbeth is under siege from the English army. So the question asks, starting from the speech, explain how far you think Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a hero. And as always, the format goes right about how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in this speech and also how he presents Macbeth in the play as a whole. As always, we need to start by looking at what exactly the question is asking us to focus on. So in this question, very clearly, we're looking at the characterization of Macbeth as a hero. It's important for us to then think about what is a Shakespearean hero. How do we go about defining what a Shakespearean hero is? So it's really important that we define this term hero in order to frame the scope of our essay. And so a question is also asking us to consider how far we think Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a hero. So it's really thinking about the extent to which Macbeth is heroic. By the way, you don't necessarily have to include the phrase to a large or small certain extent in your thesis, but it's just important for us to have this sort of awareness of the extent which should underlie our argument. So as always, in the speech and in the play as a whole, that implies that we're going to have to look at the details of this specific extract, but also look at other moments in the play that's relevant to what the question is asking us to focus on, which is Macbeth's portrayal as a hero. So, as I said just now, it's important for us to define key terms in the question. So in this context, we're thinking about what is a Shakespearean tragic hero. So there are a couple of elements that go into a hero, specifically a tragic hero in Shakespearean plays. So first, they tend to be men of noble stature. And so these are usually aristocratic or military men who are widely respected and held in high regard by those around them. And they also suffer what we call a fall from grace. And this fall from grace is an example of what we call peripeteia, which is a dramatic term for a sudden reversal of fortune or a change in circumstances. So, for example, when a well-respected general commits a grave crime and there he suffers a fall from grace. And so another example would be Othello, who starts the play being a well-respected general, but then of course he goes on to give in to his jealousy, commits a crime of killing his wife, and as such suffers this fall from grace. So, of course, in order for a hero to be tragic, he also needs to contain a tragic flaw, which is what we call the hamartia. So this tragic flaw is also what leads to the hero's eventual ruin. And examples of hamartia would include pride, ambition, jealousy, etc. And it's also important for this hero to appeal to pathos and inspire catharsis. So pathos is essentially an appeal to the audience's emotions. And so what this means is that the hero must be able to inspire strong emotions from us, from the audience. And these emotions are often sympathy or pity, but they don't always have to just be these emotions. In fact, as long as they inspire strong emotions, that already qualifies as a kind of appeal to pathos. But often when we're looking at the portrayal of a tragic hero, there's a deep sense of wasted potential. This sense that had this character not given in to his hamartia, then he would have been a great man. This is the sort of wasted potential that we're talking about. And usually as a result of this sort of strong pathos, there is consequently a sense of catharsis, which is this emotional purging, the sense of overwhelm coupled with a strong awareness that we gain at the end of the play. And then finally, tragic heroes also tend to experience some sort of final epiphany, which we call anagnorisis. And that's when the character discovers the true nature of their situation and their identity. And usually by then, it's usually too late to remedy the situation, which compounds the pathos. And so, of course, the question then is whether Macbeth embodies these tragic attributes. And so if we go back to look at the extract, what we need to do is to consider how Macbeth demonstrates those heroic qualities and also how these heroic qualities manifest in tragic ways. And so if we look at this extract, we can think about whether Macbeth is presented in a noble stature. And so we see him being courageous and determined in that he is not willing to back down, and he's committed to fighting till the end against the English forces. And his sense of courage and determination is very much reinforced by his rhetorical flourish, his use of absolute superlatives, and also the measured iambic pentameter that we see retained in this moment. In terms of an appeal to pathos, we do feel a strong sense of pity for him, because we see him here very quickly descending to the forces of evil. And we see this as a sense of kind of wasted potential, because we see him in sort of valorous stature, but unfortunately his valor, his courage are directed towards what's essentially an illegitimate and violent cause. And in terms of the hamartia, we also see that reflected here rather strongly in his hubris, in his prideful belief that he can somehow never be harmed because of what the spirits had told him, right? That he will never be harmed by man that's born of woman, and that he'll never be harmed as long as Birnam Wood doesn't come near Dunsinane. But of course, we know that the dramatic irony of this makes it even more tragic, because we know very soon after this speech, he is going to fall victim to equivocation, because the trees of Birnam Wood will move closer and closer to Dunsinane after the English forces in Malcolm uproot them and use them to hide them as they advance towards the castle. And of course, also later when Macduff reveals that he was the child of cesarean birth, and so he's technically not born of woman in a natural way. In this moment, we also actually see the sort of anticipation of Macbeth's fall from grace, the peripeteia, and that's compounded by his reference to the false thanes and the devil damn thee black, of course, because really he is ultimately the false thane, false to Duncan, and the devil damn thee black is also dramatically ironic, because in fact he has been damned by the devil as he gives in to the sort of black, darker forces of this unrestrained desire for power. And so once we gain an overall understanding of how Macbeth fits with the sort of tragic hero mold, then it's time for us to dig into those language, structural, and dramatic devices and really analyze how they help contribute to Macbeth's characterization as a tragic hero. And so here I've done my annotation. This is just a sample for you guys to reference. I would highly encourage you guys to do your own kind of annotation, but here, just to give you a couple of examples, you see that I've identified the use of iambic pentameter, which actually overarches throughout this speech. And I've picked out some imperatives, for example, in the phrase, bring me, let them fly, then fly, false thanes, and mingle with the English epicures, and thinking about how the use of imperatives kind of contribute to Macbeth as this leader, still as someone who is able to command attention and is trying to exert control. But of course, we see that in the paranoia and the sort of jumpiness of his rhetorical questions, his stature as this leader very quickly disintegrates. We see the use of superlatives in the references to no more fly all, no man shall ever have power upon thee, that his mind and heart shall never sag, etc. So these words also convey his absolute resolved and determined character. And this is in its own way a reflection of valor, but of course, you know, it's committed to a deadly course, and that compounds the tragedy, because these qualities in themselves, you know, being absolute resolved and determined, they're not necessarily bad, and they can be virtues when applied to virtuous ends. But of course, that's not the case here for Macbeth. And perhaps if we kind of couple this with the rhyming couplet with bear and fear, this adds to the sense of finality and also, you know, the pathos that we feel, because we see that Macbeth is committed to this course of no return. And it makes us feel this strong sense of pity for him, this strong sense of wastedness on behalf of him. And also there's the interesting use of synecdoche in the reference to the mind I sway by and the heart I bear, right? The mind and the heart as these bodily parts that stand in for Macbeth himself. And perhaps we can think of this emphasis on these specific body parts as an alignment of the head and heart. And so it's a reflection of Macbeth insisting that here he's acting based on rational judgment and not out of emotional rashness, right? But of course, that is dramatically ironic, because if anything, he is very much motivated by this sense of helplessness and desperation in this moment. And so, yeah, there are other literary devices that you can pick out. For example, the interpolation, when he recalls the equivocation of the spirits, right? Fear not, Macbeth, etc. And thinking about him referring to himself in third person through, this ventriloquized voice, and thinking about kind of what that implies about his fall from grace, and also this allusion to the English epicures and what that conveys about perhaps his characterization as this nationalistic Scottish hero. After this deep dive into the extract, it's important for us to take a step back, zoom out, and think about Macbeth's character development as a hero throughout the play, right? And so in Act 1, we see that he starts off being portrayed as this trusted, well-respected and valiant general as he slays the treacherous MacDonald and is then rewarded a new title, the Thane of Cawdor, by Duncan. But of course, at this moment, his ambitious desires get the better of him after he hears the witch's prophecy of his impending kingship. And as we move into Act 2, we notice that Macbeth becomes hesitant, anxious, and guilt-ridden, right? And especially at the prodding of his wife. And so he eventually commits to killing Duncan, committing that regicide, and becomes the King of Scotland. But he is not given any sort of peace of mind because he's constantly racked by worry over the repercussions of his sinful action. And as we reach Act 3, his paranoia reaches a sort of climax as he becomes reckless and violent, but at the same time realizes that he's too far steeped in guilt to turn back, right? There's no turning back, even though he feels this incredibly crippling sense of guilt over what he's done. And so he decides to go the distance. He decides to just go all out, and he orders the murder of Banquo and Fleance. And then, of course, at the banquet scene, he's haunted by the hallucination of Banquo's ghost. And as a result, he falls even deeper by seeking the witches in a desperate bid for clarity and reassurance that, yes, he will indeed be king and that no one will stand in his way. And as we reach Act 4, he becomes even more brutal and tyrannical because he decides once and for all that he's going to take down whoever stands in his way to kingship and power. And so he orders another round of murder, and this time of Macduff and his family. Macduff escapes death, but his wife and son are killed. And all of this builds up to the final act when Macbeth becomes stoic, resigned, and very much this tragic figure, especially after Lady Macbeth commits suicide. He laments the sort of meaninglessness and transience of life, really thinking about whether or not his desperate bid for power is all that worth it. But eventually he refuses to succumb, and that's what we see in the extract. And so he decides that come hell or high heaven, he's going to fight it out against Macduff. But then ultimately, the greatest tragedy is when he realizes that the witches and the spirits prophecy about him never being harmed by a man born of woman, and as long as Birnam Wood doesn't come near Dunsinane Hill, he will be harmed. All of this, he realizes that it's all equivocating deceit. And it is especially at this moment that he reaches the so-called anagnorisis, when he realizes the true situation that he is in. And all of that builds up and compounds the sense of tragedy in our perception of him as this hero. Finally, it's important for us to perhaps think about some relevant contextual links to frame our argument. And here, perhaps the most relevant contextual information would be the Union of Crowns in 1603 with James I's ascension to the English throne and the king's desire for Scottish-English unification, because of course, as we know, James I was James VI of Scotland before he became James I after Elizabeth I's death in 1603. So the Union of Crowns was an event that marked a dynastic unification of the English and Scottish crowns, but it was very much just kind of a nominal event. It wasn't a real unification because James I's attempt at creating a new imperial throne that diffused English and Scottish sovereignty was largely unsuccessful because it was met with substantial hostility from the English Parliament. And in this extract, we see Macbeth's nationalistic rhetoric when he says, mingle with those English epicures in this tone of disdain. And we see Macbeth's subsequent defeat as perhaps this message that, the sort of nationalism is ultimately not going to fly. And this sort of cautionary message would align with a narrative that fits with James I's political agenda, who was at the time very much trying to diminish this sort of consciousness around Englishness versus Scottishness. We also notice that in Act 5, we know that Malcolm cooperated with the English king and lobbied the help of the English to help him topple Macbeth's illegitimate rule, right? And he eventually succeeds and regains his rightful position as king. And so, especially after the failed gunpowder plot in 1605, this sort of betrayal would have communicated a very clear signal to any potential insurgents, warning them about not entertaining any ideas of a coup, because it won't end up well, just as it didn't end up well for Macbeth, and the rightful king is always going to vanquish over illegitimate agents. So we see kind of Malcolm succeeding at the end with the help of the English and also Macduff. This presentation of a successful Scottish-English collaboration would have scored points with James I because he was trying to advance his unification agenda at the time. And so finally, it's time for us to come up with our thesis statement. And as I've mentioned in my other past paper walkthrough video, the thesis statement is essentially your argument about the topic. And it's super important because it communicates your unique view on the topic asked in the question, right? So here's an example of what you could say for a thesis statement for this specific question and this extract. So I would say Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a man with the fundamental makings of a great hero, as one who demonstrates valor, mettle, and patriotism in the face of tremendous fear. However, Macbeth's heroism is tragic because the protagonist's heroic qualities are ultimately made to serve misguided and immoral ends. So you can see why this would be a strong thesis, because I'm here communicating my view that Macbeth is someone with all the elements of a great hero, but then unfortunately, because he applies it to immoral and illegitimate ends, his heroism becomes tragic. And so there you go. That's an example of what you could include as your argument in the introductory paragraph. So speaking of that, we need to then plan out our essay, right? So in the intro, we always want to start with a bit of contextualization. So a brief framing on the historical background then with James I as this new Scottish king and the 1603 union of the crown, and also this link to Macbeth as a Scottish war hero. And also the background of this extract, which is him being ambushed by the English forces. And so next we need to define what's really important in the context of this question, which is what counts as a hero in a Shakespearean tragedy, and what qualities does a Shakespearean tragic hero possess. And then, of course, finally, we wrap up with a thesis statement in the intro, which could be something like the one I just showed you. And then we move on to all the main body paragraphs, which would essentially be framed by our topic sentences, right? So I've decided to structure in a way where I would first talk about how Macbeth is presented as possessing heroic qualities in the extract, then move on to talk about how Macbeth's heroism is presented as tragic in this extract, before finally, in the final main body paragraph, zooming out and looking at how Macbeth is presented as a hero throughout the play, which is when we kind of trace his fall from grace from the start to the end of the play. And then finally, a conclusion where we do a thesis recall, which is essentially a paraphrasing of our argument. And finally, if you have the time, we can recontextualize and think about why Shakespeare might have decided to present Macbeth as a tragic Scottish hero, and what the bard's awareness of James I's identity as this newly installed Scottish king would have affected his artistic decisions, and how perhaps the widespread anti-unification sentiments at the time would have affected his decision to present Macbeth as he did. And with that, you are ready to write your essay. And so here's a quick walkthrough recap of all the steps that we need to do when we are given a extract-based task on Macbeth. So first, we need to, as always, highlight the focus of the question. Really think about what is the question asking us to look at. And then we move on to defining the key terms in the question: hero, Shakespearean tragedy. What does a hero mean, right? Break it down. And once we've framed out the scope of what we need to engage with, we can then look at Macbeth's characterization in the extract in particular, and then looking at the language, structural, and dramatic techniques, those key devices that enable Shakespeare's characterization of Macbeth, and then zooming out, thinking about elsewhere in the play, those other moments throughout the play that also contribute to Macbeth's characterization as a hero, and then zooming out again to consider what are the contextual links and relevant contextual information that we can bring in. Finally, coming up with our thesis statement, planning out our essay, and then writing that essay. There you have it, guys. I hope this walkthrough has been helpful for your study of Macbeth and your exams. As always, please do subscribe to my channel and hit the thumbs up button below. You can check out my Macbeth playlist, which is a comprehensive resource where you can look at my unique analysis, interpretation of key quotations, and also the play. You can also check out my Macbeth essay guide, in which I provide 6 detailed essays on commonly examined themes, and it has very detailed marking and feedback as well based on assessment objectives. And finally, you can also follow me on Instagram at Hyperbolate if you have any questions at all about your studies of Macbeth and literature. And with that, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.